significado desse olhar aprofundado num quadro mais vasto que é traçado a partir de grandes bases de dados que são analisadas mais quantitativamente. Do seu investimento teórico e empírico nestas várias questões, com estas ferramentas de estudo poderosas, resulta o retrato que ela partilhará aqui hoje, ainda de forma de esboço, porque temos muito pouco tempo para esta conferência, e vou já pedir que se despeçam da Delma, porque ela vai ter que sair a correr para apanhar o avião de regresso a Dublin ainda hoje. Portanto, vai ser ainda uma viagem para o Porto a seguir à conferência. Terminaremos às 9h45 em ponto. Vamos depois conversar entre nós e enviar-lhe o resultado da nossa conversa para podermos continuar a discussão fora deste auditório. E, portanto, a conferência vai ser sobre Fronteiras, Diálogos e Transições, a nossa temática da conferência, mas olhando para as crianças migrantes na escola na Europa. Delma, thank you so much for coming. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I'm going to try some Portuguese, so bom dia. Eu não falo português. Okay, so this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about, does the Irish education system promote intercultural values? Because we know from a lot of the research already conducted and theorised in this area that schools are an important site in society for issues around interculturalism. So, just to give you an overview of my presentation, I'm going to focus firstly giving you a summary of the documented migration trends to Ireland with a particular focus on children, just to contextualise the Irish context. Secondly, then, I'll move on and focus in more on migrant children and talk a little bit about their differing legal statuses and why that is so important as well in this area of study. So instead of just considering migrant children as a group of heterogeneous children or homogeneous children, they are, of course, a diverse group of children that are afforded different legal statuses across institutional contexts. Then I'm going to speak about inequalities along the lines of boundaries, dialogue and transitions in keeping with the theme of the conference. But in actual fact, in the Irish case, I think a lot of this relates to barriers, limited impact of dialogue and unfortunately fragmented transitions. And then finally, I'll make some conclusions. So, these are the general migration trends over the past 10 years in the Irish context. And here we can see that the impact on Irish migration patterns, with an immediate decrease in the numbers after 2008 and a persistent increase in the numbers leaving the country. So while we recently returned to migration, so there's more people now coming into the country than leaving the country, emigration has only recently begun to decline since 2014. And we've seen considerable demographic change in Ireland as the population of people with nationality other than Irish has increased by 143% in 9 years over the period 2002 to 2011. So migration and globalisation over the past decade has created an increasingly ethnically diverse and multicultural society in Ireland. So 12% of the nation's inhabitants in 2011 in the census reported that they had a nationality other than Irish. And of course this has implications for schools and for young people, these migrant young people as well in schools. So prior to the economic boom, there was some ethnic diversity, of course, evident in Irish society, but this was limited by things too much but the dominant culture was predominantly white, Irish and Catholic. Before the recession, immigration, so people coming into the country, was dominated by European migration, so followed by returning Irish migrants. As a result of the recession, there was an immediate decline in the immigration of European nationals. And over the recessionary period, returning Irish became the dominant. However, been a growth in the immigration. Show that since the recession, most national groups continue to display net outward migration patterns. There are some exceptions, however, as some national groups have displayed net inward migration to include nationals from the rest of the world. But when we talk about migration patterns, often we talk about there on the right-hand side is that while the recession has had a significant impact on patterns of migration coming into the country, adults, important for teachers that's dynamic. It's not something that just happens. And this is important because it means that it's normal, it's a normative part of contemporary life to have children from different countries entering into educational systems, even if it's not happening in big ways. So, the point to be made here now is that in the Irish context, we have the most ethnically diverse youth population that the country has ever seen. And for me, that's particularly exciting. I have 3 young children myself, and I think it's absolutely fantastic that Irish society has been opened in this way. So you can see that the ethnic diversity evident in the 0 to 14 population is much stronger than the ethnic diversity in the general population at large. So, if we think about theorising about migrant children and their families, a lot of work in this area has focused on the reproductive nature of education systems, you know, I suppose contributing and aligning itself with theories of social reproduction. But there is a need when it comes to migration to broaden the theoretical frame. And again, this is drawing on research that has been conducted in Sweden as well. And I suppose the central tenet of the concept of migration ecology is that the reception and inclusion of migrant students in schools, the pedagogical and social frameworks cannot be fully understood by focusing only on individual social background. Research for best practices and teacher skills. Rather, we need to consider the whole of the child and the whole of the children's experiences. We need to understand how individual experiences and trajectories are embedded in and conditioned by broader social contexts at different points in time, and to understand how these interact and overlap. So now I want to show you some data that I have been working on as part of a research team with colleagues in the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, but also I suppose at the height of the wave of migration to Ireland, we went into schools, into primary schools, I think that's Basico, and secondary schools. And we did some quantitative data collection around the prevalence of children in those schools. We also conducted qualitative interviews with children who had been living in Ireland, newcomer children living in Ireland, and some of the teachers and key leadership staff in the schools. So, just before we get to that point, it is also important to consider, like I said, that migrant children do not encompass, a homogenous group. there is, of course, diversity in the legal status that is afforded to children according to their migration experience. And this includes the educational experience may or may not have interest in the Irish. So this is a gap that we're... So in 2009, you can see there that had in them, over 3/4 had children from non-EU countries. And then as well, we can see that quite a high proportion of both primary and secondary schools had children with these semi-legal status. And I suppose this is where my research is beginning to develop now. So now we consider the demographics of children attending primary and second level education in Ireland. In 2009, migrant pupils as a whole accounted for 10% of students in primary schools and 6% of students in secondary schools. In a number of European countries, particularly Norway, for example, what we tend to find is that you get particular national groups or even nationalities which may be concentrated in particular schools. And this is often the case where there is a long history of migration and established second-generation minority groups. So this wasn't so evident in the Irish context. While migrant pupils were found to be attending 90% of second-level schools, this was the case for just 56% of primary schools. So just over half of primary schools had at least one migrant student attending. Now this could be due to the fact that we have a lot of primary schools in the Irish context. So most local areas have a number of small primary schools, and then the number of secondary schools decreases as children make the transition from primary to secondary. However, as I'll show later, we also examine the admissions patterns. Our data in 2009 showed that a very small number of schools had a high concentration of migrant pupils. And more recently, data produced from our National Department of Education, our broadsheets reported recently that 80% of children from a migrant background were concentrated in just 23% of the primary schools in Ireland, and that was based on 2014 data. In 20 schools, more than 2/3 of the pupils were recorded as being of a migrant background, and this segregation over the time period between 2009 and 2014 in the Irish context. Here, because the second level schools are under Catholic patronage in the Irish context. So again, this has implications context to any school area policies. But yet, schools. Legacy. Recorded two parents are as well as by admissions policies imposed by individual schools. And here we see that there are certain characteristics of schools that were most likely to report the presence of migrant pupils. So at the younger side, at the Escolas Básicas, we see that migrant children were more likely to be found in urban schools, in schools which tend to have a higher concentration of children from lower socioeconomic groups, schools that are taught through the language, through the medium of English as opposed to Irish. So in the Irish context, Irish medium schools are Gael Scoilna. They tend to be quite selective in their admission. And of course, larger schools as well. Then at the second level, what we find is that migrant children were more likely to be found in public rather than private schools, again in English medium schools, and in schools that had larger numbers of students in them. So we also examined the types of schools that tend to have a higher proportion of migrant students attending. And again, we tended to find the same patterns. So schools in urban contexts were more likely to have a larger share of migrant pupils. Schools that have a high concentration of children from socioeconomic disadvantaged areas, again, migrant children tend to be more likely to attend those types of schools. But we also find that schools that tend to have a higher proportion of students from an unrecognised ethnic minority group in Ireland called Irish Travellers. So those schools tended to have a higher migrant context as well. So students began to become located in and contextualised in the Irish context. So now to explain some of these patterns. And here I'm trying to stick interpretation, a strong commitment towards interculturalism and anti-racism. This very much contrasted with a lack of appropriate resources available to schools in terms of language support or in-service intercultural education training for teachers. So there was a very slow response to support teachers within schools, and there was a very slow national response to support those children. There were ways in which interculturalism was approached within these schools. So at times it seemed to be just a very tokenistic type of intercultural approach that they adopted. So while there was large displays each other with language, also had to have bad feeling as well about migrants as well. So it's not that all schools were extremely welcoming. And the extent to which it happened and the speed at which it happened, all of this happened very, very fast in schools. So schools went, in a very short period of time from having, a local Irish population to, a much more multicultural school population. So most schools tended to have, on average, children from about 23 different nationalities. So there was a huge explosion, really, I suppose, in terms of migration. So a lot of teachers were overwhelmed. They didn't know what language to use when talking about migrant pupils, and they were very reluctant to discuss issues relating to race and ethnicity. So intercultural policy consider in more migration. There's a new refugee access program. Your children can go to reading, writing and maths. But all of this in order schools. These criteria worked very much against newcomer populations. So what we found was that the school admissions policies, and certainly discriminating in nature, and of course there was at times a negative response by some parents. So in some schools with larger concentrations, some parents actually removed their children from the school. So some Irish parents 2016 processes. There was a lot of student voice and I suppose trying to guide policy through the use of children's experiences of their migration decisions to Ireland. And while there was a lot of research conducted in this area, there was quite a limited impact in terms of policy. So firstly, we argued that the state had a very restrictive response to rapid immigration. So, like in other institutional contexts, this big wave of migration occurred, but there was very little guidance from, the national, sorry? Okay. There was very little response at national level. So teachers and schools, they had to coordinate a lot of efforts themselves, which is a good thing, but it meant that the provision was disparate, there was a lack of guidance, there was a lot of confusion, and a lot of things. All of this discourse and the position on student experiences of the education system. So it had an impact on how they were constructed and positioned within schools. So at times they were constructed as being not worthy of receiving the supports. And at other times there was a lot of racial stereotyping as well going on. So for example, what we tended to find in our interviews with the teachers and with school management is that teachers were more likely to identify students from Eastern European countries, for example, to be much better at maths and at music. Whereas children from African countries, they tended to be clouded in a discourse of behavioural problems and difficulties. So there was a lot of racial stereotyping going on and racialisation of national groups. And of course, the dialogue, or the lack of the limited impact of dialogue was of course evident in the very slow pace of reform. So the slow pace in terms of securing supports for teachers who suddenly had a high level of, or a high proportion of migrant students with a diverse range of needs in their classroom, but also changes at the structural level in terms of supports, but also in terms of changing things like admissions policies. So our research, and a lot of research like it, was published in 2010, and the school admissions policy has just been changed this year. So reform has been slow. So then, in terms of children's transitions through the second level education, what we found is that migrant children tended to have more difficulties in terms of settling in. And I suppose we would expect that. But of course the literature tells us that it's really dangerous to see migrant, or to frame migrant children in terms of greater psychological needs rather than addressing the structural issues. Their non-migrant counterparts, and they may well be less reliant on their parents for insider knowledge about the Irish education system, and this has been found in other institutional contexts. But then, budget 2012, our harshest budget after the recession, saw the large-scale removal of hours for guidance counselling, and school management were forced to adopt a discretionary approach to its provision. So as a result, the budget has had a particularly harsh impact on the experiences of migrant students in the Irish context. And of course, guidance support around subject choices, or around future careers is of course really, really important if you don't know the system or you don't have that insider knowledge of the system, the official curriculum. So there's another paper that we published, it's in the journal Race. It doesn't lend itself to show that migrant students are more likely to be placed on track. Evidence. So, which context, migrant students on average tend to be highly motivated, and this was reflected in our studies. So the motivation of children to do well tends to be very high. So migrant students were significantly more positive about schools than other students, and of course this was seen as a kind of a mechanism for a social lift, in areas of concentrated disadvantage. So a lot of the principals in the schools had told us that the migrant students have had such a positive impact on the local students because they've really raised the aspirations for the school. And it just seems strange that those children are constructed in terms of being agents of change, yet they're inadequately supported by the system that they are indeed supporting. Principals, also I'm doing some research as well, looking into this, semi-legal status of children. And what we're finding is that principals in schools with semi-legal status, students, so principals in schools with asylum seekers, refugees, and children who are unaccompanied minors, they're more likely to view migrant students as above average educational aspirations and their behaviour than in schools without semi-legal migrant students. So in terms of the transition to higher education then, what we also find, and which is really important, is that citizenship really seems to matter for access to higher education. So it matters from a perspective of funding higher education. So if you don't have European citizenship, then of course the fees are extraordinarily high for access to higher education in the Irish context. But even in our data, among those who are making it to higher education, citizenship matters even for the type of higher education that children are pursuing. So what we find is that migrant children who don't have Irish citizenship, they're more likely to not be rather than universities. And of course we see clear effects of study. So on the one hand, while migrant students are much more likely to be in professional courses among those who make it to higher education, there is also a divide within the migrant population. So those with higher levels of resources tend to make it to the professional fields of study, contrary to those with lower levels of resources. So there are many issues, and these are just some of the issues that our research over the past 10 years has identified with regard to migrant students. So we conclude that migrant students are faced with a situation in Ireland in which they are not sufficiently recognised as bearers of pre-migratory resources and previous knowledge. So, for example, in the Irish context, there has been no efforts to acknowledge the bilingual nature of migrant students in the Irish context. Rather, they tend to be seen in deficit terms with regard to language. However, also their earlier life experiences tend to be understood through a deficit model that produces a notion of a child having and facing multiple problems. And I suppose there is this problematizing of migration in schools in the Irish context. And I suppose our research is hoping to try and produce some more emancipatory and nuanced findings around this. The dominant practices in the Irish education system are directed not to develop previous experiences and knowledge, but to rectify various real, but also imagined problems So the Irish education system has been slow to respond to demographic change. And then finally, upon understanding these practices as a whole, we can begin to understand why those aspects of the pedagogical responses that theoretically recognise prior experiences and knowledge work poorly in practice. And the function really within the broader system, or these function within the broader system, which seeks to reinforce and amplify existing differences. So, thank you very much.
Chegou, entretanto, nós tivemos de fazer uma alteração no horário da conferência devido aos constrangimentos provocados pelo voo da nossa conferencista de regresso a Dublin. E por isso ela vai fugir da sala tendo terminado a sua conferência. Vamos usar os recursos que temos nesta sala. Temos uma audiência imensamente qualificada. Ao vosso lado está alguém com quem é fascinante conversar e o desafio que ficou combinado é o sistema educativo irlandês e se chegarem a alguma ideia, alguma questão, algum comentário que achem interessante o suficiente para enviarmos para a Delma, ela deixou-nos um e-mail e eu tratarei da tarefa de fazer chegar e de mantermos esta conversa viva. Portanto, 7 minutos e meio é um bom tempo de conversa para se virarem para o lado, ou para trás ou para a frente e partilharem as vossas primeiras reações ao estado das coisas no sistema educativo irlandês. Podem fazer imenso barulho, ter uma discussão muito acesa. Bom, vejo que algumas conversas foram muito interessantes. Temos uns microfones se alguém quiser partilhar. Alguém que queira alargar a conversa às outras pessoas da sala? Enquanto tomam essa decisão, eu tenho um conjunto de avisos. Em termos do programa, o que se segue agora é um coffee break alongado, das 10 até às 11, quando começarem a sessão das comunicações paralelas. E a nossa sugestão é que esse coffee break seja feito aqui no CAFAC, onde está a haver a apresentação do livro. O livro que vai ser apresentado agora é o Labirintos da Justiça na Escola, perspectivas de alunos da Sociedade, Portuguesa de Ciências e Educação deste ano, da colega Aline Seisa. Portanto, temos tempo para celebrar essa honra. No programa de hoje temos também relacionado com a Sociedade Portuguesa das Ciências e Educação 3 momentos importantes. Teremos a reunião da secção de Educação à Distância, que é também uma novidade, que decorre hoje às 14h30 no auditório pequeno do IPD, que fica no andar de baixo relativamente onde nós estamos. As nossas assistentes podem vos conduzir lá, caso não o identifiquem. Portanto, decorre às 14h30. Às 16h, no mesmo espaço, no auditório pequeno do IPD, temos mais uma novidade da SPCE, que é a reunião do Grupo de Interesse Jovens Investigadores e Investigadoras. Portanto, teremos a primeira reunião no âmbito de uma conferência, do Congresso da SPCE, deste novo Grupo de Interesse. Temos às 17h30, como todos saberemos, os sócios, a Assembleia Geral, que decorre, mais uma vez, no auditório pequeno do IPV. Um último aviso, tem a ver com um problema de falta de informação no programa. Às 11, além das 11 sessões que estão inscritas no programa impresso, há uma 12ª sessão que vai decorrer aqui na aula magna. Têm a informação das comunicações que são apresentadas no secretariado, provavelmente receberam essa folha, e a organização gostava de mais uma vez pedir desculpa por esse lapso e às pessoas envolvidas. Hoje temos ainda, no fim do dia dos trabalhos, o jantar do Congresso. E ainda é possível inscreverem-se para esse jantar. Até às 11, portanto, agora enquanto veem a apresentação do livro e tomam o café, podem tomar a decisão sobre ir jantar. Mais uma vez, estou a receber instruções do Sr. Presidente para voltar a recordar que temos a Assembleia Geral às 17h30. E com estes recados todos, desejo-vos um resto de bom segundo dia de conferência e até breve.